Welcome to the Spunky Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, psychic medium Carrie Muggs. This is where we learn all things spirit, everything from spiritual gifts, awakenings, ghosts, aliens, and starseeds. Nothing is untouchable, but always fun and spunky. I am honored to be on this spiritual journey with you, so make sure you hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Hello, Spunksters, and welcome to this podcast. This episode is going to be so fun. This episode is about Yellowstone, the Ghosts of Yellowstone. I love Yellowstone, and to be honest, one of these ghost stories is the story that got me excited or interested in paranormal activity, because one of them is about a little boy, and when I heard the story, I was like, there is no way that a little boy is stuck at the Old Faithful Inn. So that's when I started to get into the paranormal experiences and thinking, okay, how can, what's really going on here? What's going on here? And so I got some books and I have done some research, and I have always loved Yellowstone. My parents have, we always went to Yellowstone quite a bit. We went to Island Park all the time, like every summer. And I love the feeling there. I love the feeling. I love the calderas. I love the volcanoes. They have like a special spiritual, you can just sense a difference there. And same with the park. In the park, it's just, there's the volcano there, and it's just so great. And I never really realized that there was such a history, or such a history in the you would, because it's a national park, right? But some of these stories, I was just like dumbfounded because they're so amazing. So most of the time I'm going to be reading the stories to you, but sometimes I'm just going to put a synopsis on it because I don't want to butcher it. For one, I don't want to butcher the reading, and the story, but two, some of them are too long to read the whole thing. So I'm just gonna kind of, but I'm just telling you, I know the title probably sounds boring to you, but it's so not. It's if you like ghost stories, if you like the campfire ghost stories type of thing. So the first one is, there's a ghost town in Yellowstone, and I did not know this. I had no clue. I don't know if you did or not, but there's a place called Old Cinnabar, and it's a ghost. It really is a ghost town, and it's because ghosts disappear there, and so did the whole town So the whole town, this whole booming town that was so pretty busy during when they were building the railroad tracks, was pretty booming and busy, but then all of a sudden it disappeared, and this is why. So way before there was, the campers and the RVs, and tourists came to Yellowstone National Park by railroad. So during this time, the north entrance to the Yellowstone was not only the most accessible entrance, but also the most popular way to enter the new national park, which was called Wonderland at one time, and I didn't know that either. Every summer, people from around the world would ride to the Northern Pacific Railroad, 51 miles from Livingston, Montana, to the park. The engines climbed almost 700 feet in elevation along the Yellowstone River, through Yankee Jim's Canyon, and we're going to talk about him too, until they reached the terminus at Cinnabar. The Cinnabar station, as well as the town of Cinnabar, was created by the railroad practically overnight in 1883, receiving its name from the bright red stone of Devil's Slide, a prominent narrow chute on a steep hillside 2 miles away. I think that's still there too. But in 1903, Cinnabar was eliminated as quickly as it was created. Cinnabar only existed because the Northern Pacific wanted it to. The original plans were there to lay tracks all the way to Gardner, Montana, a few miles beyond Cinnabar. The tracks, however, temporarily halted at Cinnabar because of a land squabble between Buckskin Jim, a local man who would not give up his land claim, which lay right in the path of the proposed railroad tracks. And the dispute was circumvented by building the train station at Cinnabar and then transporting the visitors by stagecoach to the Mammoth Hotel. So they only could ride the train to Cinnabar, and then they would ride a stagecoach to Mammoth, because this guy didn't want to give up his land rights. In short 20 years of its existence, until the line was eventually extended to Cinnabar was famous for a 16-day stint where it served as the Western White House for President Theodore Roosevelt. The president visited Gardner and Yellowstone National Park to dedicate the ground arch at the park's north entrance on April 8, 1903. Arrangements to accommodate the president and his entourage had not been completed at Gardner, so they had to set up camp at Cinnabar at the railroad station until their April 24th departure. So, the Secretary William Loeb conducted a presidential affairs from the state from string of. Oh, sorry, I'm butchering it even though I'm reading it. So basically, the president was there during those 16 days, and the official of the Associated Press was heard to say, well, this blooming town will be wiped off the map when we leave. He didn't know how right he actually was, because 9 days after the president left, Cinnabar was a ghost town, a virtual ghost town, with only the shelves of a few buildings left behind as a testament of its brief grandeur. When the train depot of Gardner was complete, Cinnabar disappeared into the sagebrush. So that's probably why the president was there, to make the train station at Gardner. Today, the town isn't even a shadowy semblance of a former self. Its dusty streets are gone, and all that's left are the scars made by the old train tracks, long since pulled up, and the houses, there's nothing left of those anymore. But Cinnabar is gone, but not forgotten, because sometimes when hikers go into that area, or it has been known that some have said, while they're in that area, they can hear a far-off whistle of an old locomotive. Some have even claimed to see it, and it arrives at Cinnabar just about the same time every year. Coal black in color, and it stops, and it lets a big burst of steam, and it does not have an engineer, and it does not carry a conductor. In fact, it doesn't even have passengers, but the ghost train stops just the same as it does. So to me, this is more of a residual energy. And I don't know, is that what you call it? I can't remember. But this is one of those energies that it happened so often that it's not haunting, it's just the residual energy just stays. It just keeps coming and keeps coming because that energy was there. So I think that's awesome. I also forgot to mention, you guys, that most of the stuff I'm getting were from two books. One is called Yellowstone Ghost Stories by Shelley Larios, Larios. And another one is called Spooky Yellowstone, retold by S.E. Schlosser. I'll put links at the bottom of these, but they're both awesome. In fact, it's so crazy because both of them contain a lot of the same stories, just in a different way. So I thought that was cool about the train track. There have been hikers that have heard the train coming, or they've heard whistles in the far distance of a train. You guys will also have to excuse me, because remember last week when I kind of was losing my voice? Well, this week I'm trying to get it back, and so it's semi coming back, but if I have to stop and take a drink, you're going to have to listen to it, because you know me, I don't like to edit these things. So the next one is called The Hamilton Store. Chills at the Hamilton Store. The Hamilton Store holds a prominent place in Mammoth's history. As one of the oldest buildings in the village, it holds within the walls more than 100 years of spirits. I also feel like this is residual too. So there's spirits in the specter. The specter in this story was discovered almost 2 decades ago and quite by accident, but it still remains quite active. While I was researching another story in the West Thumb area, an employee working at the Hamilton Store in Grant Village shared an experience his friend had while he was working at the Hamilton Store in Mammoth. It was the summer of 1983, and this particular employee had been working as a clerk for most of the season. One evening, just after closing, she went upstairs to the storage room to get some items to restock of the shelves. Suddenly, she heard quick, strong footsteps and rustling of long dress and petticoats. The footsteps came up the stairs and down the aisle close to her. Just as the footsteps stopped, a hand touched her, but as she turned, no one was there. She kept the experience to herself until overhearing another employee telling of a similar encounter. Both employees shared their experience with each other and agreed that they had been visited by the same spirit. It started with footsteps up the stairs, then rustling of long skirts and petticoats, and finally the touch of a hand. So who are these spirits that go up to the upstairs storage room? The strong footsteps suggest an adult. The rustling of dresses with petticoats makes it a woman from the late 1800s when long dresses were in fashion. There were 4 likely candidates. G.L. Henderson's 4 daughters. In the spring of 1882, Henderson, a widower, came to the park with his son and 4 daughters. And as they are known, that gives them their names too. One was Lily, Alex. He was a building contractor, and he probably played an active role in building the store along with with their father. So he brought his 4 daughters and his son, and they built the store. And so they think that it's Lily, the original storekeeper, who is greeting visitors and following the staff to make sure that everything in the store is in its proper place. So I thought that, so if that store is still up, I think it is. The Hamilton store in Grant Village is supposedly haunted. So, and some of these stories they say are true, but it's like every haunting, right? Like, does it have base or whatever? So this is the coolest. They're all really cool stories, but I love animals and animal spirits. So I did not know this, but there is known to be a silverback grizzly named Wab. So it's W-A-H-B, and he's humongous, and I guess he protects the park. He was known to roam in the park in 1899 or around that time, and he still to this day can be seen. His spirit can be seen, and he protects the park. So I thought this was really cool. The word Wab is the Shoshone word for white bear. Wab's story is in the Biography of a Grizzly by Ernest Thompson, was first printed in 1899, and it has since become a classic. Wab fulfills the destiny of a great silver-tipped grizzly in Yellowstone, and this is how we learn of his spirit. Wab was born in the mountains east of Yellowstone National Park, where he played with his brothers without care until one day, this is sad, he watched his family was killed by a nearby cattle rancher by gunfire. Now orphaned, he spent his days alone in the wilderness in the northwestern Wyoming. As Wab grew, he collected wounds and wisdom from man and animal. He learned to trust only his instincts. Growing into a mighty bear, he fought a lifelong battle against his enemies, and in maturity he truly ruled his territory. Wab could toss large pine trees for yards and wipe out enemies with one quick swing of his paw. Everyone and everything that knew him wisely kept their distance. And so it just kind of says that he found Yellowstone. He fell in love with it. He was protected. He felt protected there, but he also protected Yellowstone. And then one spring, he knew he was getting older, and he knew he was dying. And so one spring on his way to the park, the west wind brought to Wab the door of Death Gulch, the sour-smelling valley where everything, including the air, was dead. This odor, which was once sickened and disgusted him, now called to him, saying, "Come and find peace." I think this is where the poisonous gases are. As Wab stood at the entrance of the gulch, he saw other peaceful victims lying lifelessly near the spring. He swung his head from side to side and found it easy to breathe the strange aroma of the pungent death. That spring day, Wab laid down his sentence in Seton's word. Far below him, to the right and to the left, and on as far as the eye could reach, was the great kingdom that once had been his, where he had lived for years in his glory of his strength, where none had dared to meet him face to face. But Wab had no thought of its beauty. He only knew that it was a good land to live in, and it had been this. But now it was gone, for his strength was gone, and he was flying to seek a place where he could rest and be at peace. A rush of his ancient courage surged the grizzly's rugged breast. He turned aside into the little gulch. The deadly vapors entered in, filled his huge chest, and tingled his vast heroic limbs, as he calmly lay down on the rocky, herbless floor and gently went to sleep. He did that day like he did that day in his mother's arms by the gray bull long ago. One has only to enter the boundaries of the park to feel the spirit of Wob, the great silver-tipped grizzly. As others before him, Wob's ghost now posts himself as sentry outside Death Gulch, located in the northwestern part of the park. Wob's eternal job is to beckon others who almost must pass on, but his ghost is felt by many to be the great spirit of Yellowstone. Native Americans believe the grizzly bear to be a grandfather who renders power and strength to all. Their stories tell us he is the ruler of the beasts and masters of the mountains. This being true, it is only fitting that Yellowstone be protected by Wob, and that his ghost lives forever. I thought that was so cool too. That's like, I would like to say that was my favorite, but honestly, all these are my favorite. Like, it's so cool. Like, I want to go there now and see if I can like feel any of these spirits. Now, this one is kind of long, but it was in both of them. It was in both of the books, and so I'm just going to kind of give a synopsis of it. There's a spirit called Yancey's ghost in Yellowstone. So way up in the northeast corner of Yellowstone, midway between Mammoth and Cook City, an old and almost forgotten dirt road travels through a beautifully quiet hollow called Pleasant Valley. Along the west bank of the Yellowstone River is Yancey's Hole. So this spot, along with a few more natural areas, was named after an old gentleman named John F. Yancey. And a lot of people knew him as Uncle John. He was noted in history as Yellowstone's original squatter. So he was living there before they made it into a national park, and I don't think he wanted to leave. But he did get a lease from the government, and he built and operated a hotel in the park. So it's pretty safe to say that Uncle John came from the Kentucky way, and he was born in 1826, and it kind of tells all about him. And then he built this hotel, and he would always tell people it's the prettiest place in all Rocky Mountains, with excellent accommodations for tourists and travelers. The only truth to that was that it was the prettiest place in the Rocky Mountains. People would complain because the rooms were really drafty, the beds had lice, and the food was so bad that the complaints were made continuously to the park's superintendent. And the hotel had 5 small rooms upstairs, all with single beds, only holding a wash bowl and a water pitcher and a towel. And the only thing that was different is the room numbers were like written with chalk above the doorways, and only the bridal one had a mirror. So, but it was also known to have the best whiskey, and it was by far the best tasting stuff around Yellowstone. So he was pretty interesting fellow. He was pretty colorful. He was there for a really long time. No one really knows why he went there. But this hotel that he had actually ended up hosting the famous as well, and the famous and the nameless. So it got pretty, after it'd been there for a while, and I think they did some changes to it. He had a grand and elite circle of patrons that were famous after a while, like sportsmen and politicians, such as President Roosevelt. In fact, President Roosevelt came to visit him in April 24th, 1903, and then the president dedicated the cornerstone of the arch at Yellowstone's north entrance, and then Yancey caught a cold that week, and it quickly turned to pneumonia, and he died May 6th, right after that, after President Roosevelt was there. And it was said of his passing that the park lost one of its most colorful characters. And so he's still known to, even though that hotel, he was buried in a place called Tinker Hill, but that hotel was burnt down. So there's no doubt that he still visits quite often, but he visits other hotels. So today, Yancey's ghost presence is especially felt at the Roosevelt Corrals. President Roosevelt, right? One night, they sometimes tell people that they'll go in to take care of the horses, and the horses are already completely taken care of. But why does Yancey's ghost linger around the Roosevelt area? Because sorry guys, I'm trying to read, and it's because he's chosen the lodge because it was familiar to him because his place was burnt down. And also, too, he was where he was buried on Tinker Hill. It wasn't part of the park when he was buried there, and then it became part of the park. And the closest hotel to Tinker Hill was this Roosevelt Lodge. So I thought that was kind of cool. So lots of people know of the spirit of Yancey. So I thought that was awesome. Now, I wanted to give special there's a couple of my favorite ones coming up. I mean, this podcast might actually be a little bit longer than most because there's a lot of these stories, but this one is kind of cool. I couldn't talk about the spirits of Yellowstone or without bringing this one up. So, the spirits of Bannock. Bannock is the name of an Indian tribe who shared the Snake River Plains southwest of Yellowstone with their relatives, the Shoshone. The Bannock were really nomads. Before they had horses, they traveled on foot in Idaho, parts of Nevada, and Utah, and Wyoming. And so the Bannock Trail, or the Great Trail of the Indians, is what it's called because after the horses were introduced, they were expanded to include what become Yellowstone National Park. And so when they got horses, they could go further. And then the Bannock traveled using the same trail for about 40 years, from approximately 1838 through 1878, and it's called the Bannock Trail. And the common view was that no one owns Mother Earth, right, but only lives and shares it during a very short lifetime and then becomes part of it in the afterlife. So the Native Americans sought wisdom and strength from spirits, and ancestral spirits were invited into their personal lives to provide counsel through life's journey, which is crazy because that's what we do, right? Because the early Native Americans did not believe in heaven, hell, or any other unearthly dwelling for that matter, the tribal elders taught that the souls of the dead remained on the earth and became one with natural habitat. These spiritual perceptive people were accustomed to living among the reflections of their ancestors. They felt close to them and knew their strength as they traveled and camped along the Great Trail. Spiritual leaders often saw and talked to spirits on the Great Trail, for this is where many were born and many died, and this is where many spirits still linger. So today you can travel part of the Great Trail in the park. It's a beautiful drive and well-kept dirt road, the Blacktail Plateau Drive. The drive starts approximately 9 southeast of Mammoth off the road to Tower Junction. Along the drive, you can almost see the campfires and teepees that once marked the Great Trail. Be sure to drive slowly and get out and take a moment to look for the spirits' ghostly reflections in the rocks and the hills and feel their inspiring presence in the trees in the forest. They're watching over you. Now that gives me chills because I felt that not when I was in the park, but in Sedona. We were on a trail hike in Sedona, and you could literally see the spirits of the Native Americans that had been there, and it was the craziest thing ever. So that's on Bannock spirits blending into the wilderness, perhaps the cloudy shadows that float across the trail. So if you go to the Great Trail, remember that these Native Americans are there. So. Okay. Also, this one it's not really a ghost story, but I couldn't talk about Yellowstone weird happenings, without bringing it up. It's not really a ghost story. People don't know if it's a psychosis thing or a ghost story because, there was a man who got lost for 37 days in Yellowstone, and, he had quite an experience. He was starved. While he was lost, he would talk about spirits or monsters or things that were in the forest that were leading him or guiding him or trying to help him, or some of them that were trying to scare him. So there was an exploring party, and he was sick and couldn't really go with them when they first started, but then he caught up to him. But then somehow he got lost. And this was in 1870, and it's called the Washburn-Langford-Doane Expedition. And it was it kind of started the whole expedition of going through Yellowstone. And so among them was a man named Truman C. Everett, and he was an ex-U.S. assessor from Montana. and he got lost. He was on the brink of starvation. He was wandering, and it led him to a small lake, but he had no way of catching fish to eat it. He didn't know how. He was not an outdoorsman very well, so he was like the least one of the parties to get lost. So Everett's called, so he'd start seeing companions. So he started calling them impressions of insanity. He said he was constantly aware of traveling in dreamland. Or was it a nightmare? He felt that he possessed duality of being. He talked to different beings which he felt came from within himself. They constantly reminded him of his condition and fed his imagination. Everett said to seem to be remain perfectly conscious of the morbid influences and did at times try to shake them. But he found that they often returned with reinforcements. So a lot of people are like, okay, did somebody try to help? Were these spirits trying to help him and guide him, or were they part of his own psyche? So they did. He ended up, one of the spirits kept saying, go back immediately. Go back as fast as you can. So he turned around and went back. And the apparition explained that there was no food in the mountains and that he was trying to scale, and the rocks were sheer madness. So at first, the guy resisted, and he felt that the Yellowstone River was too far for him, but the apparition convinced him that his life depended on his returning back to the Yellowstone River. So then he decided to return to the Yellowstone River, and then he lost all sense of time. Days became nights. He had no idea that he was gone for 37 days. And so we don't know for sure if it was Everett's prayers for his forgetfulness were answered, but we do know that when he was found by Yellowstone Jack near Devil's Gut, some 50 miles north of where he became lost, he was inarticulate and irrational. He had been lost in the wilderness for 37 days. They actually, after he wrote a book about it too, I guess it's a pretty interesting book, and they even offered him to be an honorary superintendent of Yellowstone, and he denied. He denied it. He did live to tell his story, and but he, to this day, nobody ever knows if it was his spiritual companions or his psyche. So that was kind of cool. The next one is called Maddie's Spirit. So this is about a girl who was very, I guess everyone loved her. She was one of those high-spirited girls. She got married, and her husband died of tuberculosis. But then her next door she lived next to a guy named Ellery, and they started to, as Maddie and Ellery spent more time together, they were helping each other get through I guess he lost his wife. And there was quite a bit of an age difference, I think, too. And Ellery had served in the Civil War like her father and had worked for Northern Pacific Railroad and had her, so did her first husband named Eugene. So their lives paralleled, they started to fall in love, and they were married on April 6th, 1886. So after the wedding, they moved to their house, and then on June 22nd, they welcomed their first baby, little girl named Theta. Soon after the birth of their daughter, they packed up and went to Yellowstone National Park. He had accepted a position of Master of Transportation with the Yellowstone Park Association. And on July 26th, with Theta in their arms, Maddie boarded the train for Livingston and eventually Cinnabar, which we already talked about, right? From there, she took a stagecoach 8 miles to Mammoth. I wonder why. Mammoth Hot Springs, and finally to the Firehole Basin, where she was reunited with her beloved Ellery. So they fell in love with Yellowstone, and they would go back many times, or back each summer. They would leave in the autumn and then go back. But one time, I think it was their second time, Maddie could tell she was starting to get sick. She was starting to get tuberculosis, and she was starting to cough a lot, and she knew, we don't know how sick she became before her death, but it must have been pretty bad. And then Maddie died on March 2nd, 1889, and although her tombstone indicates that she was 30 years old, she was in fact 32. And then Ellery took their daughter to Maddie's sister, and Ellery continued to work in Yellowstone. She died a little shy of her third wedding anniversary. So soldiers at a nearby station came over and they buried her. by Firehole. So what's now by the Firehole, that where I don't know if you can go there anymore. When I was little, you used to go and be able to see all the chipmunks running around Firehole, but you can't really. I tried to, and I don't know if you can go there anymore. So, but they tried to make the best grave they could for her, and they there was a hotel, a Firehole hotel that the brief service was given, and she was tenderly laid to rest near the riverbank about a stone's throw from the old Firehole Hotel. Ellery stayed at the hotel with their daughter until April, and then Theda went and lived with Maddie's sister, Millie. So, Ellery stayed with Theda at her Aunt Millie's, but soon felt Maddie's spirit and heard her beckoning call. He returned to her, continuing to work in and around the park, always heeding Maddie's haunting call. In 1891, before being obsolete, the old Firehole Hotel was burned down, giving way for the new Fountain Hotel, a few miles up the road. The change left Maddie's grave in solitude. Ellery still visited Theda often, but always returned to Maddie in Yellowstone, the Yellowstone that they both loved so much. Theda actually died when she was 19 years old, and Ellery worked 3 more years near Maddie in Yellowstone. Finally, age and health dictated that he move to the old soldiers' home in California. He lived there for a short time, and he passed in 1922. And Ellery was actually buried in California. He could not be buried next to Maddie. The National Park Service forbade it. He was buried in National Soldiers Home Cemetery that is now in Los Angeles. So it's known that Maddie will roam the forest, or Maddie will talk to the people who stop by. Or if you stop at Firehole, people have been known to have. There's a lady that says that she did have lunch by a picnic table, and she had a full conversation with a lady named Maddie, and she went to spot a fly and turned around and Maddie was gone, and then she went over and she walked over and saw that Maddie's grave was there. There's also a known man to be walking around a stranger, like a spirit walking around trying to find Maddie's ghost. So, but I don't really think that they're doing that, right? Like, I think that, truth be told, that's where the trauma happened, and that's where part of their soul still roams. That if you have listened to some of my podcasts about soul fractures, the trauma happened there, and so that's where part of their souls remember that, because we lose, part of our soul when we go through, and that's why I'm going to talk about this one too, the Phantom Child at Old Faithful Inn. The youngest and newest spirit to take up residence is that of a boy. The young specter story was revealed late one evening while researching information on another spirit. While walking in the Old Faithful Inn, I met a young auburn-haired lady from Georgia. Basically, there's a little boy that runs around the Upper Geyser Basin to spend a few hours. Okay, where does he run around? He only runs around on a certain floor, and he is lost, he tells you, and he can't find his mom or his dad. And you ask him for his parents' names, but he will tell you nothing. So you ask him his name, and he still doesn't tell you anything. Then you decide to go get help, and when you get up to go get help, he's gone. And so when you go to the front desk, they've heard the story before, so you feel embarrassed, so you try to explain, but an explanation is not necessary because this is not new. Our phantom has been trying to find his family for more than 30 years. He has appeared to hotel guests as well as those visitors who have just stopped in for ice cream. All who have seen the boy, 3 things are constant. He seems to have an accent, he haunts only the second floor, mezzanine, and he only appears once to them. In fact, they go back to find him and they can't find him at all. So I thought that was kind of cool. But here's the thing. I don't feel like that little boy stuck there. I don't feel like he's not in heaven. I feel like his trauma was that he lost his parents. He was trying to find him. And it was a pretty traumatic thing for a 4 or 5-year-old. Because I could just tell you, I am a grandmother. And if my 4-year-old lost his mom, he would be so traumatized even for a minute. So I think that the trauma stays there. And that's the spirit, that energy stays there. Because he doesn't try and hurt anybody. He doesn't try and scare anybody. He's not malevolent. It's just kind of the same thing. It's the same story, right? Okay, now you can't tell Yellowstone ghost stories without telling this one. This one's the most known, and nobody really knows how true it is. So this one is known, and then I'll talk a little bit about a couple more, and then we'll be done. So I know this one's going to run a little long, but I mean this podcast. So the Headless Bride. Everybody, most of the Yellowstone stories have been known for the Headless Bride. There's the Headless Bride of the Old Faithful Inn. And they don't know if this was entirely a true story or if it was just made up. But if you give something enough intention, or you can, because we're creators, right? So if this is something talked about and talked about and talked about and talked about, then we can, as humans, create it. So who knows, right? You could always talk about that. During the fall of 1982, George was a bellman, and he was finishing up the summer season. He had another employee that were closing the inn in preparation for a long winter ahead. While reading in his room, a little past midnight, George heard someone down the hall. Knowing that everyone was supposed to be gone, he put down his book and walked to the balcony overlooking the lobby. So what the people say that they see, George ran into the balcony where it was in time to see a transparent figure ascended from the crow's nest high above the lobby. The figure was draped in a white flowing gown. It was a young woman not too much older than a child, and she was carrying tucked under her arm her head. George called out for the other employee, and they left the inn that minute and did not return. That winter, while doing research in the library at Missoula, Montana, George discovered that there had been a death, perhaps even a murder, at the inn in the summer of 1914 that took place in room 127. A couple who had just gotten married came there to spend their honeymoon at what seemed to be the grand and glorious day for the two newlyweds, eventually turned into a nightmare. There was an argument, a fight, and the groom left to never return. It was thought by everyone that his bride had overcome with grief and had locked herself in their room, refusing food or service of any kind. After a few days, the staff became rather worried about the young lady, so the manager sent a member of housekeeping staff to the room 127 to see if she was okay. When the housekeeper opened the door, he found the young bride laying in the bathtub in a pool of blood without her head. In more time, pieces of the tale surfaced. Investigations found that the young girl of 15 was the only child of a rich and affluent family, and she was heir to a $1 million shipping firm in New York City. She had fallen in love with a family servant much older than her. The affair was discovered, and the girl immediately fell from her father's grace. He saw through the ambitious man's plans of marriage in order to join the family business. The daughter refused to listen to her father and insisted they be wed. So the father agreed to a quiet wedding and sent them west for the honeymoon, and life without further family embarrassment. By the time the couple had reached Yellowstone and the inn, the young man had managed to gamble away all the money, which was meant to last them until he could obtain employment and property. The young bride was sent to by her husband to contact her father by telegram and petition for more money. Her father refused to send the money, but instead offered to send a train ticket for his daughter to return home. At the news of that, the husband became livid, and the couple fought all night. When the sun rose the next morning, the young bride was dead, and her groom had disappeared. The bride's father was notified by the park officials, and he arrived heartbroken. A few days later, all news concerning his daughter's death was hushed and discouraged of any chance of scandal. Eventually, the bride's missing head was found in the coroner's crow's nest at the inn. By then, her body had already been disposed. When all of the daughter's affairs had been put in order, the father returned home at New York City. His life resumed, and nothing was ever spoke of the daughter again. So this is also residual, because she doesn't harm anybody, and nobody sees her doing anything else. She just is going back and forth to the crow's nest to get her head. So, and that would be a very big trauma for somebody, right? And it's also, too, that some people think the husband returned. The husband's ghost is also there because of the trauma that happened, and he returns to the place, and you can see him. He's dressed as a sailor, and in 1970, there are reports of the staff that someone is frequently runs the halls, rattles doors, and shakes windows because he's checking to make sure everything is tightly closed up. So, but I think that could be the Yancey guy too. But this guy looked like a sailor, so that's not true. So that is the most popular ghost story for Yellowstone. And some books say that it's true, some books say that it's not. So, or it was just a story made up. But I don't know. I couldn't tell you. I have been an Old Faithful and haven't seen either the boy or the bride. So maybe we can keep going and see. So there is also known a vanishing hitchhiker that used to work at Mammoth Hot Springs and in 1994, Mark Elliott was driving down the street and he ran into a woman who, it started to get dark and it was raining and she was in the middle of the street. She kind of had a petticoat on. She looked older. He gave her a ride and he took her to a hotel where she was a waitress. And then he went back to his hotel and he was so kind of like, he had left her raincoat. He gave her his raincoat. And so they had talked on the ride. She had caught a little bit of cough too. And then he dropped her off at her hotel. Then he went to go stay at his hotel, which was a couple miles down the road. And he had talked about, to his hotel's door person, talked about the hotel down the street, and the door guy was like, there is no hotel down there. So he went down there. This is a really long one. So once he found out there was no Canyon Hotel, it had burned down years ago, and this is where she had said she worked. Her name was Victoria. And Mark bolted out the door, jumped into his car, and headed north to the hotel. He drove as fast as he could, but the traffic was slow. Mark couldn't believe it. He got out of his car and ran to the hotel and where he had stood the night before, and it wasn't even there. How could it have disappeared? Searching for answers, Mark walked through the grass and found only broken blocks of cement belonging to the hotel's once grand mile-round foundation. Hurt and confused, Mark drove to Mammoth and found Yellowstone Library. He got information and found information on a Victoria, and then he walked across the street. That's who he had picked up as the Victoria, and then he walked across the street. He sat down to think. Gradually, he realized he was sitting near a young woman and that she had uncanny resemblance to Victoria. He stared at her. She was reading her book. And he stared at her. She was reading a book, and she said, "What's going on?" He smiled and said, "I was just reading about an employee whose name was Victoria, who worked at the Canyon Hotel a long time ago." Mark looked at the book. It was called Death in Yellowstone. The woman showed Mark the page where Victoria was listed as being buried at the Fort Yellowstone Army Cemetery. She had been a waitress at the Canyon Hotel, and she had died on July 22nd, 80 years ago, exact day that Mark met her. So Mark met her on July 22nd, 80 years later. Obtaining directions for the young lady, Mark drove to the old cemetery. As it was small, gated closure, he noticed something draped over one of the headstones. It was his raincoat. He went over to pick up his raincoat, and the name on the headstone read Victoria Venable. Immediately he had heard a clap of thunder, and yes, he thought it was almost time for her to go to work. He told Victoria goodbye and wished her peace. That was a crazy one. That one was awesome. So she's the unknown hitchhiker known as Victoria in Yellowstone. There's also two other ones. There was a kind of a guy named LSC Waters, and he was known as the Pirate of Yellowstone Lake. He would con people. He would make ferries or he would make the boats, and he would con people to pay him to go across the lake, and he was kind of a con artist, and he even got kicked out of the park at one time, and he went and tried to buy. They think he might have poisoned his daughter so he could get more money, and then he got a bigger boat, and the national park only let him because then he thought he could have more people, because he was already like putting way more people than he should on the boats, and it was kind of a safety hazard. And so then he went and got a bigger boat, and they only allotted him to like have 10 more spots, which really pissed him off. So then he got pissed and he like mad and he like drew holes in the boat so then nobody could take her or swim with her. And so he's known, his spirit is known around the lake or around that island. And also, one of his employees that was working for him accidentally fell in Yellowstone, which goes to our next. And he never tried to retrieve the body, or he never went and got the body. And so that guy is also known as walking around the waters of Yellowstone Lake too. But the crazy thing about Yellowstone Lake is it is kind of like known as the whispers of Yellowstone Lake. There's lots of sounds or noises that that the lake makes. So, supernatural or not, the whispers of Yellowstone Lake have in fact been scientifically documented but never explained. The whispers are described as mystic aerial sounds which rise up from the lake. They come in early morning when the air is still and the sky is cloudless, and the sounds are similar to the vibrations of the electric harp. They are said to start off a low, soft hum, which can be heard from a great distance. As the hum draws near, it becomes louder and louder. Then it passes overhead and slowly starts to die away as it continues in the opposite direction. It lasts no more than a half a minute or so. No one knows exactly what it is. Many have speculated, trying to label the sound. Some say it's the wind blowing or the trees. Some insist that it sounds like a swarm of bees, but that it's impossible because the eerie sound often happens in the dead of winter. Others have said it sounds like electricity in the air, the whistling wings of ducks, or the eruption noise of steamboat geysers. Maybe the sound belongs to its own class of aerial echoes. The lake has also been known to never give up its dead. So usually it's really, really cold. And so usually when people fall in the lake, most of them die of hypothermia. And very rarely are any of the bodies found. That I think in this book it said that maybe there was 40, don't quote me on that had passed in the lake, and none of them were actually ever found. So anyways, the lake has a lot of history too, the whispers of the lake, and then even the rivers where people have been found, and where this guy who was a pirate that was kind of crazy is too. So I love that. And I think the whispers of the lake could just be the land itself, honestly, because the land has so much energy. Land and areas, I mean, even people that come in during readings at the end sometimes will say, a lot of spirits will be like, I don't care if you sell the house, it's not a material thing. But some of the spirits will say, keep the house because of the land, because they've grown not attached, but they've just loved the land. It gives the land its own vibe, just like Yellowstone itself is just a beautiful kind of sacred experience. And I feel the same at Island Park. There's places all over the world that are like that. Machu Picchu, the Stonehenge, Sedona, just different places. I mean, Earth has her spiritual places too, just like we do. So anyways, there you go, guys. That was a fun little Yellowstone. Sorry if I was a little monotone sometimes, but I was reading most of the stories because I didn't want to butcher them. Some of them were way too long, so I had to just kind of put them together. But those are the stories that got me interested in the paranormal, because of the little boy at the Old Faithful Inn. I did not in a million years think that his spirit is still there running around Old Faithful and not with his ancestors. So a lot of the stuff at Yellowstone is residual. It's the residual energy that returns. It's not malevolent. It's not. None of those were really malevolent stories. Most of them were traumas that happened to these people in the land, and so they stay there, or part of their soul stays there. So I thought that was interesting. None of these stories that I've heard, I did read one story in the other book, The Spooky Yellowstone, that there was a benevolent spirit. But it's because I think she pulled it. She did it. She was calling to it. So it wasn't anything about the land or Yellowstone itself. She was dabbling in some stuff that wasn't great. And so that's the only one I read. And lots of the hotels have people roaming the halls or spirits roaming the halls, but that's pretty normal any hotel, right? Pretty much any hotel you see nowadays, there's because so much energy goes through them that it's gonna then lots of people, lots of traumas happen. So lots of stuff. So the hotels, but that's pretty normal. So I hope you guys like that. It was kind of fun for me, and let me know. Send me DMs and stuff of what the type of things that you like to listen to so I can make more of them and I can research it for you. So I love you guys so much, and I will see you guys next week. If you liked this episode of Spunky Spirit, please hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Share it with friends and family that you think would enjoy it too.